They threw a broke veteran out into the storm, but his loyal dog led him to a secret worth more than $250 million buried beneath his grandfather's old house. On a freezing night in the mountains of Wyoming, a Marine veteran was thrown out by his late wife's family. Broken, with nothing left but an old backpack and his loyal Belgian Malinois, Scout, who once saved his life in Afghanistan. He thought it was the end, but the dog led him back to his grandfather's forgotten cabin and to a secret buried beneath the floor. It was a truth worth more than $250 million, and it would change everything. Rain came down in thin needling sheets that blurred the dirt road into a river of brown. Jack Harris stood at the edge of the Miller family's ranch drive. The old duffel over his shoulder grew heavier with every drop that soaked through it. His breath fogged in the Wyoming cold, and beside him, Scout stood still. He was a large Belgian Malinois, with a scar across one ear and the calm, watchful eyes of an old soldier. Behind them, the porch light of the farmhouse flickered weakly through the storm. Jack didn't look back, but he could still hear the last words Helena Miller had spat at him through the screen door. "You've had 2 years, Jack. 2 years of living off our kindness. Time you learned to stand on your own." He'd wanted to shout to remind her that he'd fought for 20 years in a desert half a world away so she could sleep under that porch light. But he didn't. He'd simply nodded, packed his duffel, and taken the one thing that had never betrayed him. Scout had followed without needing to be called. Now the only sound was the wind hissing through the pines. Jack adjusted the strap on his shoulder. Water streamed down the back of his neck. Scout pressed against his leg, shaking once as if to say, "We're still here." Jack looked down at him and gave a thin smile. "We've survived worse, buddy," he said softly. "We'll survive this too." They started walking. The road out of Pine Hollow curved through the valley like a scar. Each step crunched against the gravel, echoing in the empty night. Far off, thunder rolled against the mountains, the kind of low rumble that always made Jack's stomach knot. He tried to breathe past it, but flashes of light in the distance sent his thoughts sliding to a different kind of storm. It was one filled with sand and fire, not rain. Scout sensed it. The dog moved closer, brushing his side against Jack's thigh, grounding him. Jack muttered a quiet thanks, though his voice was nearly lost in the wind. The town lights faded behind them within the hour. What waited ahead was a dark, endless stretch of highway and the smell of wet sagebrush. Jack's truck had been left behind. Marcus Miller had made sure of that, keeping the keys until you get back on your feet. Jack doubted Marcus ever intended to return them. He walked until his legs trembled. Every joint ached the way they had since the IED blast in Helmand. When he finally stopped, he and Scout took shelter beneath the awning of a closed gas station. The sign above them creaked in the wind, Pine Hollow Fuel and Feed. Jack sat on the cold concrete, leaned back against the wall, and closed his eyes. He could still hear Helena's voice from earlier that evening, the sharp edge of contempt when she'd said, "Sarah's gone, Jack. You're not our family." She'd said Sarah's name as if it meant nothing, just gone, as though his wife had never existed. Scout laid his head on Jack's knee, amber eyes watching the dark. The dog didn't sleep. He never slept deeply anymore. Neither of them did. Jack ran his fingers through Scout's damp fur, the motion rhythmic, almost prayerful. A passing semi roared down the highway, splashing water over them. Jack didn't flinch. He just stared out at the rain, wondering what came next. He had $43 in his pocket, no car, and no one waiting for him. But he had a memory, something his mother once mentioned before she passed. An old cabin up on the northern ridge, left by Jack's grandfather, abandoned after the old man's death decades ago. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next morning, the rain had slowed to a cold drizzle. Jack woke stiff and sore, his clothes half frozen. Scout nudged his shoulder, tail wagging once, ready to move. Jack stretched, grimaced, and looked toward the north. "All right, pal," he said, slinging the duffel over his back. "Let's see if Grandpa's ghost left us a roof." They followed the cracked highway until it turned into a dirt trail winding through the foothills. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. Pines rose on either side like sentinels, their branches dripping with mist. Every few miles, Jack stopped to rest, rubbing his knees and glancing at the bruised sky. Scout trotted ahead, nose to the ground, alert for coyotes or deer. By dusk, they reached the ridge. The house wasn't a house anymore. It was a skeleton of what it had once been. Half the porch had collapsed, and the roof sagged in the middle like a broken back. One shutter banged lazily in the wind, but the chimney still stood black with soot and memory. Jack took a long breath. The place smelled of pine, damp wood, and faintly, strangely, of oil and metal. Scout sniffed the threshold, ears pricked, tail low. "It's home," Jack murmured, "for now." He pushed open the door. The hinges screamed in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust. A family photo hung crooked on the far wall, his grandfather in a miner's uniform holding a pickaxe, a proud grin under a layer of grime. The bottom of the frame read, "Rocky Ridge Mining Company, 1947. Jack stared at it a moment longer than he meant to. Then he found some old firewood in a corner, coaxed a flame from his lighter, and got a fire going in the rusted stove. The room filled with orange light and the smell of burning pine. Scout circled once, then lay down near the warmth, sighing deeply. His eyes closed, but his ears stayed twitching. Jack eased himself into an old chair, the wood creaking beneath him. Outside, the wind howled through the eaves, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't in a tent or a hospital bed. He was somewhere that might, with enough work, become his again. As he watched the flames dance, he noticed something half buried in a crack above the mantel. It was an envelope so brittle it crumbled when he touched it. Inside was a single note written in faded ink. "William Harris, property rights secured. Never trust anyone who asks about the land." Jack frowned, turning it over. On the back was a faint smudge, maybe a fingerprint, maybe just dirt. Scout lifted his head, ears tilting toward the floor. He gave a low growl, staring at one particular spot near the hearth. Jack followed his gaze. One of the floorboards was darker than the rest, like it had been replaced more than once. "Yeah," Jack said quietly, watching the firelight glint in Scout's eyes. "I feel it too." He leaned back, exhaustion finally winning. Scout's tail thumped once, slow and steady. As the storm rumbled outside and the fire burned low, the two of them drifted toward uneasy sleep, the sound of rain mixing with the whisper of old secrets buried deep beneath the floor. When Jack woke the next morning, the fire had gone out, and the world outside was white. Snow blanketed the valley, softening the jagged ridges of pine and rock that surrounded the house. His breath fogged in the cold air. Scout was already awake, sitting at the door, staring out through the crack in the warped wood. "Morning, soldier," Jack murmured, rubbing his hands together. "Guess we made it through the night." He found an old tin coffee pot and boiled snow over the stove. The smell of smoke and bitter coffee filled the room. As he drank, his eyes wandered to the photograph over the fireplace again. It showed his grandfather standing in front of a mine shaft, proud and grim under a soot-covered face. Jack remembered the stories his mother used to tell about William Harris. A miner, a hard man, maybe even cruel by today's standards, but honest. He'd built this house with his own hands. The old man had never trusted banks, never trusted the government, and apparently not even his neighbors. When he died, everything, house, land, debts, had gone quiet, lost to time. Jack walked through the house slowly, coffee in one hand, flashlight in the other. The place was a museum of decay. The wallpaper peeled from the walls in long strips. Dust covered everything like a second skin. There was a faint smell of oil and iron coming from below the floor. Faint, but distinct. Scout followed close behind, ears pricked, nose twitching. In the kitchen, Jack tested the faucet. After a long groan, brown water spat out, clearing into a weak stream. "Well, would you look at that?" he muttered. "Running water. You and me are fancy now." Scout wagged his tail once, as if amused. He spent the next few hours clearing debris, dragging old furniture to one side of the living room, patching a hole in the wall with boards scavenged from the porch. His hands were numb, his breath steady in short clouds. The rhythm of work helped quiet his mind. For a while, the ghosts of war stayed quiet. By late afternoon, sunlight cut through the broken windows, laying gold stripes across the dusty floorboards. Jack sat against the wall, sweat drying cold on his neck, and watched Scout chase a drifting beam of light. "Feels good, doesn't it?" he said softly. "Just working. No orders, no pity." Scout barked once, a sharp, happy sound that echoed through the empty house. For a moment, Jack almost smiled. He walked out onto the porch. From there, the world stretched wide. Rolling fields gone to weeds, a line of black pines marking the edge of the property, and beyond that, the rising spine of the mountain. Somewhere down there was Pine Hollow, but from here it could have been 1,000 miles away. The air smelled clean and sharp, full of snow and pine resin. "This is ours now," Jack said quietly. "No one to throw us out." That night, as the temperature dropped, he fed the stove until the metal glowed dull red. The room filled with a steady living warmth. Scout curled up beside him. Jack unfolded the brittle letter he'd found above the mantel and studied the handwriting again. Property rights secured. Never trust anyone who asks about the land. It didn't make sense. Who would have asked? Why hide something here in the middle of nowhere? He flipped the paper over and held it closer to the light. The back was blank, except for what looked like the faint outline of numbers. Coordinates, maybe. He traced them with his finger, but couldn't make them out. A sudden noise made him look up. Scout had lifted his head, ears pointing toward the floor again. The dog gave a low, uneasy growl. Jack frowned. "What is it, boy?" Scout patted across the room, nose close to the floorboards. He sniffed near the hearth where that one board looked darker than the rest. His claws tapped the wood. Then he whined softly and looked up at Jack. Jack crouched beside him, pressing his hand to the plank. It felt colder than the others. He tapped it lightly. The sound was different, hollow. He leaned back on his heels, heart picking up a little. "You've got quite a nose, partner." He found a screwdriver in a rusted toolbox near the stairs and began prying at the edge of the board. It resisted, creaking stubbornly. Scout paced nearby, tail low, uneasy but alert. Finally, the board gave with a groan, splinters scattering. Beneath it was a small cavity, maybe 2 feet deep. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a faded photograph and a small metal tag. The photo showed William Harris again, this time standing with 3 other men in front of a sign that read Rocky Ridge Mining Company, 1947. The metal tag was stamped with a serial number, and the words "Mine Permit, Federal Claim." Jack turned the tag over in his hand, the metal cold and slick with age. "What the hell were you up to, Grandpa?" He set it on the mantel next to the old letter. Scout watched him, head tilted as if trying to read his expression. That night, the wind came back, shaking the windows in their frames. Jack couldn't sleep. The house groaned with every gust. His mind wouldn't stop circling the same thought. His grandfather had hidden something here. Something important enough to warn his family about even after death. He remembered the way Helena Miller's husband, his brother-in-law Marcus, had looked at him when they'd thrown him out. The sneer, the certainty that Jack would never get back on his feet. He'd felt powerless then, but here now, there was something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. A direction, a reason. He rose quietly, pulled on his jacket, and stepped outside. The snow had stopped. The moon hung low over the ridge, throwing silver light across the fields. The air was so still, he could hear Scout's breathing behind him. Jack looked out at the mountain line, the black timber stretching north. Somewhere out there beneath decades of silence and snow, his grandfather's secret waited. "Tomorrow," he said to the night, "we'll find out." Scout pressed against his leg, warm and solid. His tail brushed once against Jack's coat. Jack smiled faintly and headed back inside. The fire still glowed dimly, painting their shadows against the wall. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt the faint pulse of hope, fragile, uncertain, but alive. Morning came sharp and cold. Frost filmed the inside of the windows, and the wind outside carried the crisp bite of early winter. Jack brewed another pot of coffee, its aroma filling the cabin with something close to comfort. Scout stretched near the hearth, yawning, his paws twitching as if chasing dreams. "Big day ahead," Jack said to him, pulling on his jacket. "Let's see what else Grandpa left us." The sun crept slow over the ridge, painting the valley in pale gold. Jack spent the morning walking the property line. The land stretched farther than he remembered. Old fence posts leaning at odd angles, fields gone to wild grass, the faint ruins of what might have once been a barn. Scout trotted beside him, stopping now and then to sniff the air or stare into the woods as if remembering a sound Jack couldn't hear. Near the creek that wound behind the house, Jack spotted a rusted metal sign half buried in mud, W. Harris Claim Boundary. He crouched to brush it off, his breath fogging in the air. "Well, you weren't kidding about owning land," he muttered. Scout barked once, splashing through the shallows. The sound made Jack laugh. A rusty, unused sound. But it faded when his knee twinged sharply, the old wound from the blast in Helmand flaring up. He sank to one knee, clutching it until the pain eased. The flashbacks came fast sometimes. The blinding heat, the smell of burning fuel, the screaming radio. He blinked hard, trying to stay anchored in the snow-covered creek bed. Scout ran to him, whining softly, pressing his head against Jack's shoulder. "I'm all right," Jack whispered, gripping the dog's collar. "I'm all right, pal." They stayed like that until the shaking passed. Then Jack rose, brushing snow off his jeans, forcing a smile. "Let's head back before I freeze solid." By midday, clouds gathered over the ridge. He spent the afternoon cleaning out the second room of the cabin, a space thick with cobwebs and the smell of dry rot. Beneath a tarp, he found old tools, boxes of nails, and a generator coated in decades of dust. When he pulled the cord, it sputtered once, coughed, and died. A knock at the door startled him. Scout was already on his feet, tail stiff, a low growl building in his throat. "Easy," Jack said, reaching for the shotgun leaning by the door. He opened it a crack. An older man stood outside, bundled in a thick canvas coat, his beard white as the snow around his boots. His truck idled on the road behind him, exhaust curling into the cold air. "Didn't mean to spook you," the man said, raising his hands. "Name's Frank Dalton. I live 2 miles down the ridge. Saw smoke from your chimney and figured I'd check who moved in." Jack relaxed slightly and stepped aside. "Jack Harris. This is Scout." Frank grinned at the dog. "Looks like a good one." "The best," Jack said simply. Frank accepted a mug of coffee and sat at the old table, his hands rough and scarred from years of work. "William Harris's place, huh? Haven't seen anyone up here since your granddad passed." Man kept to himself, but he was solid hard as the rock he dug through. "You knew him?" Jack asked. "Everybody knew of him," Frank said. "He worked the old Rocky Ridge mine till the company shut down. Some said he hit a vein worth a fortune before they closed it. Never proved it, though. He walked away with nothing but this land and that house." Jack frowned. "A fortune?" Jack asked. "Rumors," Frank said, sipping his coffee. "But I remember hearing folks from the mining office came asking questions right after he died. Then the house got boarded up, and nobody talked about it again." The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. Jack stared at the photo of his grandfather on the mantel, then back at Frank. "You think there's anything still here?" Frank chuckled, rising from his chair. "If there was, it's long gone now. But I'll tell you this, your grandfather didn't trust anyone. He hid things, papers, cash, maybe worse. Wouldn't surprise me if this place still has secrets." After Frank left, the cabin felt quieter than before, almost expectant. Jack leaned on the table, turning the old mining tag over in his hands again. Scout rested his chin on Jack's boot, eyes half-lidded. That night, sleep wouldn't come easy. The house creaked and sighed with every gust of wind as if whispering to itself. Around midnight, a faint thump echoed from below, deep, metallic, rhythmic. Scout's ears shot up. He growled low and steady. Jack grabbed the flashlight and the shotgun, heart pounding. He crept down the stairs to the cellar, the wood groaning under his boots. The beam of light cut through the dark, catching on spiderwebs and dust motes. Nothing moved, but the smell of earth was strong, wet, old, mineral. Scout padded ahead, sniffing along the brick wall where the mortar looked newer, smoother. He stopped, pawing at it once. Jack ran his hand over the surface. The texture changed halfway across, like someone had patched it up long ago. He rapped his knuckles against the bricks. A hollow echo answered him. "Different material," he murmured. "You hearing this too, boy?" Scout gave a short bark. Jack studied the wall, the chill of the basement crawling up his spine. He could almost hear Frank's voice repeating in his head. "Your grandfather didn't trust anyone." He took a step back, shining the light across the bricks. One section near the floor had faint scratches, as if something heavy had been dragged there once. He crouched, tracing the marks with his fingers. The brick was cold and slick under his touch. For a moment, he thought he smelled oil, old, metallic, faintly sweet. It reminded him of the mines in Afghanistan, of machinery buried under sand. Scout whined softly beside him, restless. "All right," Jack whispered. "We'll deal with this tomorrow. Daylight, huh?" He switched off the flashlight and climbed the stairs. The fire upstairs was almost out. Scout curled up beside him, still uneasy, eyes fixed on the floor. Jack pulled a blanket around his shoulders and sat in the dark, listening to the wind moan around the house. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, just the sounds of an old building settling in the cold. But deep down, a different feeling had taken root, half fear, half excitement. For years, he drifted through life, waiting for something to matter again. Now, in this forgotten cabin in the middle of nowhere, he could feel it. A story buried under the floor, waiting for someone stubborn enough to dig it up. Scout's breathing steadied. The storm quieted. Outside, the moon climbed higher, casting silver across the windows. Jack stared into the dying embers and whispered, "Whatever you left down there, Grandpa, we'll find it." The next morning dawned gray and bitter. A new storm was forming over the ridge, the kind that could trap a man for days. Jack decided to spend the day inside, reinforcing the windows and stacking more firewood, but his eyes kept drifting to the basement door. By noon, wind was already howling again, sweeping snow sideways across the clearing. The sky darkened with heavy clouds, turning the daylight into a dull, colorless wash. Jack built the fire high, the flames snapping with defiance. Scout lay near the door, muscles tight as if waiting for something unseen. "Relax, pal," Jack said, tossing another log into the stove. "We're safe here." But even as he said it, the walls shuddered with the force of the wind. The sound reminded him of mortar blasts, and his pulse kicked into overdrive. He squeezed his eyes shut, taking slow, controlled breaths. The trick never really worked. In his head, the wind wasn't wind anymore. It was gunfire. The crack of rifles, and the deep thud of explosions. The smell of burning pine warped into diesel and dust. He could almost hear shouting over the radio. "Jack," someone had yelled in memory. "Jack, get down." He jerked awake, realizing he'd been gripping the rifle beside the door. His heart thudded against his ribs, and Scout whined softly, nudging his hand. The dog's touch pulled him back to the present. He knelt beside Scout, burying his face into the dog's neck. "I'm okay," he murmured. "I'm okay." Thunder cracked outside, sharp, too close. The cabin trembled. Jack rose and checked the door latch, but something made him freeze. Beneath the noise of the storm, there was another sound, a low groan, wood shifting, then a loud snap. Scout was already up, tail stiff, nose pointed toward the living room floor. The sound came again, another groan, followed by a deep cracking noise. Jack swung his flashlight toward the hearth. The beam wavered as the house shook. Then it happened. One of the old floorboards near the stove split down the middle with a jagged tear. Dust and ash burst into the air as a chunk of wood dropped into a dark space below. "Easy," Jack barked as Scout lunged forward. The dog sniffed the hole, growling low. Jack crouched beside him. The opening was small, but deep, and a faint draft of cold, stale air wafted upward. He leaned closer, shining the flashlight inside. At first, he saw nothing but darkness. Then, when the lightning outside flashed, the beam caught something metallic, a dull glint that winked from below. Jack's heart hammered. "You seeing that, boy?" Scout pawed at the edge of the hole, whining with urgency. He fetched the crowbar from the tools by the door and began prying up more boards. They came loose with reluctant squeals. The deeper he went, the colder the air became. Finally, he widened the hole enough to see a narrow staircase made of stone descending into the earth. Jack's breath fogged in the beam of the flashlight. "A basement under a basement," he muttered. "You've got to be kidding me." Scout barked once, sharp and excited. The storm outside built to a roar. Lightning lit the room, and for an instant, the whole house flashed white. The thunderclap that followed was deafening. Jack steadied himself on the crowbar, his pulse racing. He considered waiting for daylight. He really did. But something about the way the wind pressed against the windows made him feel like if he didn't go now, the house itself might swallow the secret again. "All right," he said, slinging the flashlight onto his wrist strap. "You stay close." They descended slowly. The steps were slick with damp, the walls cold and rough beneath his fingers. The beam of light quivered across old support beams and stacks of rotted crates. The air smelled of earth, iron, and time. At the bottom, the space widened into a small chamber. The stone floor was uneven, covered in silt. The light swept over remnants of old mining gear. A rusted pickaxe, a coil of rope, a lantern blackened with soot. Then the beam landed on the far wall. Half the wall was brick, newer than the rest of the stone. Mortar seams ran unevenly, too clean for their age. Jack stepped closer. The metallic glint he'd seen earlier shone faintly between the bricks. It was a small plate, half buried, engraved with something he couldn't read. Scout padded up beside him, nose to the wall. The dog let out a sharp bark, startling Jack enough to drop the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, spinning until the beam landed directly on a section of the wall where the mortar had cracked open. Behind it was metal, dull gray, with a faint outline of a circular handle. Jack stared, his breath coming faster. "That's not no way." He brushed at the dirt with his hands, clearing away loose debris until the shape came into view. A vault door, small but unmistakable. The handle was brass, tarnished with age. The words W. Harris, property of Rocky Ridge Mining Co. were stamped above it. Jack swallowed hard. "You really did it, old man." He gripped the handle and twisted. It resisted for a moment, then turned with a grinding screech. The door creaked open an inch, releasing a puff of dry, cold air. Inside, the darkness was thick and silent. He shone the light in, expecting cobwebs, maybe tools or junk. Instead, the beam caught the faint shimmer of something that shouldn't have been there. Edges of metal, dull yellow gleaming beneath layers of dust, gold, or something close to it. Jack's throat went dry. He reached out a shaking hand and picked up one of the objects, a coin, heavy and perfectly round, stamped with the year 1899. His pulse thundered in his ears. Scout barked again, this time softly, as if to break the spell. Jack laughed once, breathless. Looks like Grandpa wasn't crazy after all. A deafening boom split the air above them. The house shook violently. Dust rained from the ceiling. Jack spun toward the stairs. "Come on, buddy." Out. They scrambled up, the flashlight jerking wildly in his grip. The moment they reached the top, another gust hit the cabin so hard the door slammed open, wind and snow roaring inside. Scout lunged forward, bracing himself against the gust. Jack forced the door closed again, heart pounding. For a moment, they just stood there listening. The storm was raging full force, battering the walls like artillery. But all Jack could think about was the small vault below, the gold glimmering in the beam of his flashlight, and the words his grandfather had written decades ago. "Never trust anyone who asks about the land." He sat down heavily beside the fire, still shaking. Scout rested his head on Jack's knee, eyes steady and calm. Outside, the wind howled like something alive. Jack stared into the flames, mind racing. There was no doubt anymore. His grandfather had hidden something real, something valuable, and maybe dangerous. "Whatever's down there," he whispered, "we just opened the door to it." The storm answered with another crash of thunder, and in its echo, Scout lifted his head and growled low, as if he too understood that nothing in their lives would ever be simple again. When morning finally came, the storm had blown itself out. The air outside was eerily still, and the snow lay heavy across the porch, muffling every sound. Jack rose from the chair, his back stiff, the events of the night before flickering through his mind like fragments of a fever dream. The hole in the floor was still there, jagged and black, breathing a faint chill into the room. Jack crouched beside it, flashlight in hand, and peered down. Everything looked the same. The staircase, the broken crates, the glint of the open vault. Yet now, that daylight filtered through the cracks in the shutters. The shadows didn't feel quite as menacing. He tied the flashlight to his wrist again and descended, Scout following close behind. Each step groaned beneath their combined weight. The smell of earth and old iron filled the space. At the bottom, dust motes danced in the beam of light. The vault door still stood ajar. Inside, the air was dry and still, untouched for decades. Jack knelt and examined the contents properly this time. He brushed away a layer of grime from the shelves inside. There were small leather pouches tied with string, yellowed papers sealed in wax, and a heavy ledger bound in cracked brown leather. The pouches clinked when he picked them up, coins unmistakably old. He poured one into his palm and stared at it. Solid gold, smooth from age, the edges stamped with the date 1899. "Grandpa," he breathed. "What were you sitting on all these years?" Scout circled the vault once, sniffing the air, his nails clicking softly on the stone. Jack stacked the coins neatly, counting in silence until he lost track somewhere around 50. He picked up the ledger and turned to the first page. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, looping in ink that had browned with time. Accounts of Rocky Ridge Mining Co. proprietor William Harris. Page after page listed figures, purchases, shipments, dividends. Then toward the middle, Jack found entries marked private yield, followed by coded numbers. He frowned. The last entries dated 1962, the year his grandfather had died. The handwriting grew shakier near the end, but one line stood out, underlined twice. "Trust no one. The gold is only part of the truth." Jack sat back, the words echoing in his mind. He'd expected maybe a stash of forgotten coins or tools, but this stock certificates, ledgers, notes about mining rights, was something else entirely. It looked like the remnants of a business empire, or the start of one. He carried the ledger and a few documents upstairs, setting them on the table beside the fire. Outside, light spilled over the snow, filling the cabin with a quiet glow. Jack wiped his hands on his jeans, leaving smudges of earth behind. Scout climbed onto the rug, resting his head on his paws. The dog's steady gaze followed Jack's every move, as if sensing the weight of what they'd uncovered. Jack sat for a long time, staring at the papers. Each document felt like a piece of a puzzle he didn't know existed. But one thing was certain: his grandfather hadn't just been a miner, he'd been a man guarding a secret. He unfolded a yellowed map tucked inside the ledger. The edges were brittle, the ink faded, but he could still make out the boundaries of Rocky Ridge Mining Company, a massive tract stretching across Wyoming and into Montana. And in one corner, written in small, careful script, "Core claim beneath house property." Jack blinked, his pulse quickening. "Core claim," he said aloud. "This place isn't just built on rock, it's built on the mine itself." He looked toward the floor, imagining the tunnels that might snake beneath them. It explained the hollow sound, the strange drafts of air. He spent the afternoon cataloging everything. Coins in one pile, documents in another. The ledger, though, he couldn't put down. He flipped through every page, tracing the steady decline of his grandfather's life. The profits, the deals, the sudden stop. The last entry simply read, "The others are gone. I buried what's left." Jack rubbed a hand across his face. "The others," he murmured. "Who the hell were the others?" Scout gave a low bark, startling him. Jack followed the dog's gaze toward the window. Outside, a figure was moving down the old trail, a dark speck against the white snow. Jack squinted. It wasn't Frank Dalton. This man was younger, taller, moving with a deliberate pace. He stayed still until the figure disappeared behind the trees. Scout's ears stayed up for another minute before lowering, but Jack's gut twisted with unease. Maybe just a hiker. Maybe not. By evening, clouds rolled in again, the sky bruised purple. Jack fed the fire and sat at the table, the gold coins glinting faintly beside the papers. The weight of them felt unreal. After years of scraping by, he was suddenly sitting in a room filled with enough to change everything. But the thought didn't bring peace. Instead, it stirred a kind of dread. He looked at Scout. "We're not telling anyone about this yet. Not until I figure out what it means." Scout wagged his tail once in solemn agreement. That night, Jack placed the ledger and coins back inside the vault, locking it as best he could. The sound of the latch echoed in the silence, deep and final. He dusted his hands off and climbed back upstairs. The cabin creaked as the wind picked up again, whispering through the eaves. Jack sat by the window, watching the tree line. The man he'd seen earlier hadn't returned, but the snow carried strange patterns, tracks that started near the creek and vanished halfway up the trail. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Scout shifted uneasily, then stood, nose toward the door, ears forward. Jack grabbed his rifle, easing the safety off. The night was still for a long moment. Then, far away came the crunch of footsteps on snow. Jack's pulse leapt. He stepped to the window. A light flashed once between the trees. A flashlight beam, faint and brief. "Not a hiker," he muttered. Scout's growl deepened. Jack tightened his grip on the rifle and whispered, "All right, buddy. Whatever this is, we handle it like old times, quiet and ready." The light flickered again, then vanished. Jack stood by the fire until his legs cramped, waiting for it to return. It never did. Eventually, exhaustion won out. He sank into the chair, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the dark window. Scout curled at his feet, ears twitching even in sleep. Outside, the wind whispered across the snow, carrying with it the scent of cold iron and pine, and something else. The faintest echo of footsteps receding into the trees, leaving behind the uneasy knowledge that he and Scout were no longer alone on the mountain. By morning, the tracks were half buried beneath a new layer of frost. Jack followed them anyway, moving slowly through the woods with Scout beside him, their breath fogging in the pale light. The prints led to the ridge trail, then vanished into a mess of animal tracks and wind-scattered snow. Whoever had been there knew how to cover their path. He stood still for a long moment, scanning the tree line. "Someone's watching," he muttered. Scout's tail stiffened, nose high, reading the air. Jack exhaled sharply. "All right, let's get this figured out the right way." Back inside the cabin, he spread the ledger and documents across the table again. The more he looked, the less it seemed like an old man's hoard. This was organized, planned. The stock certificates were stamped with company seals, signatures, dates. One page carried the name Rocky Ridge Mining Company, but in smaller print, almost like a later amendment, was another Helios Mining Holdings, Incorporated. That was the moment it clicked. He'd seen the name before on mining trucks that rolled through the valley years ago, and on the news when environmental groups filed lawsuits over contaminated streams. Helios was still alive and thriving. Jack tapped his finger on the company name. "You're not dead, are you? You just changed your skin." Scout looked up at the tone of his voice, ears perked. "I think it's time we find someone who can read all this legal mumbo-jumbo," Jack said. He packed the papers into a worn duffel bag, threw on his coat, and headed down the snowy road. Frank had loaned him an old pickup for the trip to Jackson Falls, which took nearly an hour. The road was a winding ribbon through pine and ice. The town looked almost too normal. Kids dragging sleds, a cafe steaming up its windows, people laughing without a care. For Jack, it all felt a world away from the cabin and the secret buried beneath it. He parked in front of a brick building that read Monroe and Carter, attorneys at law. Inside, a young woman looked up from behind the reception desk, startled by the sight of the tall, bearded veteran still dusted with snow. Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for Grace Monroe," Jack said, "old friend of my dad's." The receptionist nodded and disappeared into the back office. Moments later, a woman in her late 30s appeared, dark hair pulled into a low bun, glasses perched on her nose. Her voice was brisk but kind. "You must be Jack Harris," Frank Dalton called ahead. "Said you might drop by." Jack smiled faintly. "Frank likes to talk more than I do." Grace's eyes softened. "He also said you might have found something worth talking about." Jack set the duffel bag on her desk and unzipped it slowly. She leaned forward, curiosity turning into disbelief as he laid out the documents, gold coins, stock certificates, and the brittle ledger with Rocky Ridge Mining Company embossed across its cover. "Good Lord," she breathed, running her hand gently over the paper. "These are authentic. Where did you get them?" "They were hidden under my grandfather's house," Jack said. "I think he owned part of the mine back when it started, but I need to know what that means now, if anything." Grace pulled one of the certificates closer, squinting at the fine print. "These are pre-merger shares. If they were never sold or transferred, and if Helios Mining Holdings is the legal successor, the ownership may still have survived the merger." She looked up at him, eyes wide. "Jack, this could be worth millions." Jack frowned. Millions? She nodded. The company's still active. I'd have to confirm with the state registrar, but on paper, these could represent real equity, real ownership. Jack leaned back, stunned. He kept it all hidden all these years. Maybe for good reason, Grace said quietly. A fortune like this doesn't stay buried without someone wanting it that way. A sharp bark echoed outside the office. Jack turned. Scout sat by the truck, visible through the window, alert and staring down the street. Grace followed his gaze. He's trained better than most men I know. Jack smiled briefly. He doesn't miss much. Grace nodded slowly, then glanced back at the documents. I can start the verification process today, but Jack, once I file these inquiries, it won't stay quiet. Companies like Helios have long memories and deeper pockets than you or me. Jack's jaw tightened. I'm not selling anything. I just want to know what's real. Fair enough, she said. Give me a few days. Jack thanked her and stepped outside, the cold air biting at his face. Scout stood at attention, tail low, eyes locked on a black SUV parked across the street. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside. Let's go, buddy, Jack muttered. He climbed into the truck, starting the engine. The SUV started too, pulling away slowly, as if by coincidence. Jack took the long way back through the valley, checking his mirrors every mile. The SUV followed for 10 minutes, then disappeared down another road. Still, the unease stayed with him all the way home. The sun had set by the time he pulled up to the cabin. The snow around the porch had been disturbed, footprints half melted leading from the road to the steps. Jack killed the engine and sat still for a long moment, scanning the shadows. Scout's low growl broke the silence. Jack grabbed his rifle and stepped out, boots crunching in the frozen slush. Easy, he whispered. They followed the prints to the side of the cabin where something glinted faintly in the beam of his flashlight. A cigarette butt, fresh. Jack crouched, his stomach tightening. Whoever it was, they'd been close, watching. He stood, staring into the dark woods. Snow fell again, soft and steady, erasing the evidence with each passing second. Inside, he bolted the door and checked the latch on the basement hatch. Everything seemed untouched. But when he entered the kitchen, something small caught his eye. A thin smear of mud across the floorboards by the window. Someone had been inside. Scout patted over, sniffing the spot, ears flat. Jack's hand tightened around the rifle. He stepped to the window, looking out into the night. Nothing moved but the trees. He reached down, rubbing the dog's head. They're not just watching anymore, Scout, he whispered. They've already been here. Scout pressed against him, tail low, his body trembling, not with fear, but readiness. The same kind of readiness Jack remembered from the battlefield. That silent understanding between two soldiers before the fight begins. Jack looked toward the mountains beyond the cabin. The wind had picked up again, whispering through the pines like a warning. Somewhere out there, Helios, or whatever shadows it had left behind, had caught the scent of the past he'd unearthed. And they were coming. That night, Jack barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every groan of the wind made his nerves jump. Scout paced by the door, restless, ears flicking toward sounds only he could hear. Around 2 a.m., the generator sputtered once and went dead, plunging the cabin into silence. Jack rose from the couch, grabbed the flashlight, and swept the beam across the room. Everything looked normal. Still, he felt that tightness in his chest, the one that had saved his life too many times overseas. The air had that wrong feeling again. He checked the window. Snow was falling thick, but he could see tire marks near the tree line, fresh ones. He'd cleaned the drive that morning, which meant someone had been there after dark. Scout, he whispered. The dog was already at the door, body tense, eyes fixed on the forest. Jack pulled on his coat, slung the rifle over his shoulder, and stepped onto the porch. The cold cut through him like a blade. He moved slow, scanning the yard with the flashlight. The beam caught a faint reflection near the fence line, a glint of metal. He crouched. A bullet casing lay half buried in snow. His stomach dropped. He turned toward the woods, and that's when the shot came. The window beside him exploded in a burst of glass. Jack hit the ground, dragging Scout with him behind the porch beam. A second shot echoed closer this time, hitting the wood post above his head. Inside, he hissed. Scout darted through the open door. Jack rolled after him, slamming it shut. He killed the light, crouching low, heart hammering. The only illumination came from the moon through the broken glass. Scout's growl rumbled deep in his chest, a sound that carried both warning and fury. Another shot hit the doorframe, then silence. Jack crawled to the side window and peeked through a crack in the boards. The forest was nothing but black and white, but he could just make out the faint silhouette of a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, moving away toward the road. He exhaled shakily. Whoever it was didn't want to fight. They wanted to send a message. When dawn finally came, the world looked almost peaceful again. Sunlight touched the snow like nothing had happened. But the footprints outside told a different story. Two sets this time, one heavy, the other lighter. Maybe a lookout. Jack found a single cigarette butt near the truck. Same brand as the one from before. He pocketed it, jaw tight. "You're getting sloppy," he muttered. Scout limped slightly when he moved, a shallow cut on his flank where glass had caught him. Jack cleaned it carefully, whispering soft reassurances. "You're fine, buddy. We've had worse, right?" The dog licked his hand, tail thumping weakly. By mid-morning, Jack had repaired what he could and called Grace from the landline. The phone crackled with static. Grace Monroe. Her voice came through faint but steady. "Grace, it's Jack. Someone came by last night, took a few shots at me." There was a pause. "Jack, are you hurt?" "No, but they're not just watching anymore. I think Helios knows." "I haven't told anyone," she said quickly. "But Jack, the inquiries I filed, they triggered something. The state registrar flagged those shares. Within hours, I had calls from a corporate legal firm in Denver asking if I was representing the Harris estate. They knew your name." Jack's gut tightened. "Then they know where I live." Grace hesitated. "You need to leave the cabin for a while. Go somewhere safe." "Safe doesn't exist for guys like me," he said quietly. "But I'll keep you updated." After hanging up, Jack drove into town for supplies, gas, canned food, extra ammunition. He kept his head down, but even then, he caught a glimpse of that same black SUV parked across from the diner. Same tinted windows, same stillness. He didn't stop to eat. On the way back, he detoured down an old forest road to make sure he wasn't being tailed. He wasn't. Not anymore. But when he reached the cabin, a new unease settled over him. Scout barked before they even reached the porch. Jack's boots hit the snow and froze in place. Someone had been inside again. The door latch hung broken. The interior looked ransacked. Drawers open, papers scattered. The ledger lay on the floor, pages torn, and the vault key he'd hidden under the stove was gone. His pulse spiked. He dropped to one knee, checking the vault hatch, still locked. He exhaled slowly. They hadn't found the hidden vault. Scout pawed the floor by the window. Nose pressed against a new boot print. Fresh, heavier than Jack's. The intruder hadn't even tried to hide the trail this time. Jack followed it out to the road until it disappeared near tire tracks leading downhill. That same SUV again. That night he sat by the fire, rifle across his lap. Scout asleep beside him. The clock ticked loud in the quiet. Every few minutes he'd catch himself glancing at the window. He thought of Afghanistan, how the worst part wasn't the firefights but the waiting, the silence before something broke. This felt the same. Around midnight, a faint light glimmered through the trees. Not headlights, something smaller, handheld, moving slow. Jack slipped outside, silent as the snow. Scout followed, his paws leaving shallow prints behind him. They crouched near the woodpile, eyes fixed on the glow. A man was walking the ridge. His flashlight swept the ground as if he were searching for something. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, pulled out a phone, and spoke into it. Jack couldn't hear the words, but he caught one name when the wind shifted. Gaine. Jack's breath caught. He recognized the name from one of the documents. Richard Kane, CEO of Helios Mining. He waited until the man turned away, before retreating back inside. His hands trembled as he bolted the door again. "They're not just after gold, Scout," he said quietly. "This is bigger." Scout rested his head on Jack's knee, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight. The dog didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, the fear under the resolve. Jack looked out at the frozen forest one more time. The light was gone, but he knew now that whoever Richard Kane sent was coming back, and next time they wouldn't just be looking. 3 days passed in a haze of gray skies and sleepless nights. The wind cut colder, the snow fell thicker, and the mountains seemed to hold their breath. Jack kept the fire burning day and night, waiting for the next move. He fixed what damage he could to the cabin and reinforced the doors with planks from the old shed. Scout stayed alert, following every sound outside. Then one afternoon, an unfamiliar black sedan appeared on the road below the ridge. It was too clean, too new to belong to any of the locals. Jack watched it climb the icy hill through binoculars. His pulse quickened when it stopped right in front of his porch. The driver's door opened. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out, adjusting his scarf against the wind. He looked wildly out of place against the snow and timber. His confidence told Jack everything. This wasn't a neighbor. This was Helios. Jack stepped outside, shotgun resting casually in his arm. "You lost?" The man smiled, his teeth white and sharp. "Mr. Harris, I presume." His voice was smooth, practiced. "My name's Richard Kane. I represent Helios Mining Holdings. I think we have some business to discuss." Jack said nothing. Scout stood beside him, fur bristling. Kane looked down at the dog with faint amusement. "Impressive animal. Belgian Malinois, right? Former service dog. They say those things are smarter than most people." "Depends on the people," Jack said evenly. Kane chuckled softly. "Fair enough. May I come in? It's freezing out here, and I'm not here to cause trouble." Jack hesitated, then stepped aside just far enough for Kane to enter. The man brushed snow off his coat as he walked inside, his polished shoes clicking against the old floorboards. His eyes moved over the cabin with the businessman's precision, taking in every detail. The patched windows, the firewood stacked by the stove, the rifle leaning against the wall. "You live simply," Kane said almost approvingly. "I respect that. Your grandfather did too, from what I've read. A proud man, hard worker." Jack's jaw tightened. "You know about my grandfather?" "I make it a point to know about anyone connected to Helios," Kane replied, turning toward him. "Especially those holding forgotten assets." Jack met his gaze. "You mean the stock certificates?" Kane smiled. "I prefer to call them legacy documents. Outdated technically, legally complicated, but yes, those." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew an envelope, setting it on the table between them. $5 million, he said calmly. "Offered in good faith. In exchange, you sign over all claims to any Helios-related property, shares, or materials. Quick, clean, and generous." Jack barked out a short laugh. "You're serious?" "Completely," Kane said. "You see, these old records cause confusion, bureaucratic headaches. We'd prefer to resolve it privately before it reaches any public forum." Jack leaned forward. "And what happens if I say no?" Kane's smile didn't fade, but his tone cooled. "Then you invite a lot of attention you don't want. Lawyers, auditors, government agencies digging through your life, and you'll discover just how many ways we can make something like this disappear." Scout growled low, his body pressed against Jack's leg. Kane's eyes flicked toward the dog, but he didn't flinch. Jack stood slowly, towering over him. "You're trespassing. I think we're done." Kane exhaled softly and slipped the envelope back into his coat. "I understand your hesitation. Pride is a powerful thing, but so is survival, Mr. Harris. You might want to remember which one you can actually live on." He buttoned his coat and moved toward the door. Before leaving, he paused and said quietly, "Your grandfather was a stubborn man too. It didn't end well for him either." Jack froze. "What did you just say?" Kane smiled again, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Helios keeps excellent records. Good day, Mr. Harris." The door clicked shut behind him. The black sedan rolled away down the snowy trail, its taillights fading into the mist. Jack stood motionless for a long moment, the words echoing in his mind. It didn't end well for him either. He looked down at Scout. "You hear that, boy? Sounds like a threat." Scout whined softly. That night, the cabin felt colder despite the fire roaring in the stove. Jack sat at the table with the ledger open again, searching for something. anything that could explain what Kane meant. The last few pages of his grandfather's notes were almost unreadable, but one line stood out under a smear of ink. They took everything but the truth. If you find this, protect it. Protect it. That was what Kane was after. Not just money or stock, but a truth someone had buried deep enough to kill for. Jack pulled a small metal box from under the bed. It was an old ammunition case. Inside, he carefully placed a copy of the documents, the gold coins, and the ledger pages he'd scanned using Grace's office copier. He buried the box behind the shed under frozen earth. Scout watched every motion in silence. When he came back inside, he noticed something new, something that made his stomach clench. A small black device lay on the window ledge, tucked behind the curtain. He picked it up carefully. A bug, a listening device. His hand shook with fury. He threw it into the fire where it hissed and popped, melting in the flames. "They're not bargaining anymore," Jack muttered. "They're listening." Scout barked once, sharp and urgent. Jack turned through the window. Faint headlights flickered once on the ridge before vanishing. He grabbed the rifle. "They're not done, Scout. Not by a long shot." The dog stood beside him, tail low, eyes focused. The two of them stood there in the glow of the fire, silent, ready. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft at first, then heavy, burying the road, the tracks, and whatever came next under a shroud of white. By midnight, the storm had swallowed the mountain whole. Wind howled through the chimney, pushing smoke back into the room. The cabin creaked under the weight of the snow. Jack checked every latch and window, his pulse steady, but cold in his veins. Scout followed close, silent now, tail twitching with unease. He'd lived through enough ambushes to know the feeling, the way the air thickened, the way silence itself seemed to hold its breath before the first shot. He stoked the fire one last time and sat in the dark. "They'll come tonight," he said quietly. "Storm's cover enough." Scout gave a low rumble deep in his chest. An hour passed, then another. The fire had burned down to embers when Scout's head lifted, ears pricking. Jack froze. A faint sound threaded through the wind, a crunch of snow, deliberate and close. He moved to the window, pushing a finger through a small crack in the curtain. The world outside was white and blurred. But in the distance, he saw them. 3 dark shapes moving through the trees. Slow and careful. Jack exhaled. "All right, buddy. Showtime." He grabbed the shotgun, loading shells with quick, practiced motions. Scout was already by the door, every muscle ready to spring. The first noise came from the back, metal scraping against wood. They were trying to pry open the window. Jack slipped into the hallway, footsteps soundless on the old boards. He pointed the barrel toward the sound, then glass shattered. Cold air rushed in. Jack fired once. The blast echoed like thunder. A scream followed, cut short by the storm. He heard retreating footsteps, then silence. Scout lunged toward the front door, barking sharply. Another crash, someone forcing it open. Snow blew inside as 2 men burst through, flashlights slicing the dark. Jack fired again, aiming high, driving them back. Scout leapt through the light, teeth flashing. One intruder fell hard, shouting as the dog tore into his sleeve, dragging him down. The other raised his gun. Jack shot the lamp beside him, glass exploding in his face. The man screamed, blinded. "Scout!" Jack shouted. "Back!" The dog obeyed instantly, retreating to his side, chest heaving. The first man staggered up and ran out into the snow, blood trailing behind him. The second crawled after him, yelling something Jack couldn't hear over the wind. For a long moment, the only sound was the storm. Jack lowered the shotgun, listening. He didn't trust the quiet. Then, faintly, came the hum of an engine. He turned toward the window just in time to see headlights sweep through the trees. A black SUV rolled up the drive, tires spinning in the snow. The passenger door opened. Another man stepped out, tall, lean, wearing a long coat. He wasn't hiding. Jack felt the hairs on his neck rise. This wasn't a hired gun. This was the one in charge. The man walked toward the porch, snow crunching underfoot, and stopped just short of the steps. "Mr. Harris," he shouted over the wind. "Let's not make this uglier than it has to be." Jack raised the shotgun again. "You already made it ugly when you sent them. The man chuckled, unbothered. They were overzealous. I just need what's in that vault. It doesn't belong to you. Jack's voice was calm, deadly. You tell Richard Kane he's not getting a damn thing. The man tilted his head. I am Richard Kane. Jack froze. Kane smiled, his breath fogging in the air. I didn't come all this way to negotiate through lawyers. Jack, I came to clean up a very old mistake your grandfather made. Scout growled, teeth bared. You think he was some hero? Kane went on, his tone colder now. He stole from us. He buried what wasn't his. And you. He gestured toward the cabin. You just dug it up again. Jack's finger tightened on the trigger. Funny thing about thieves, Kane. They usually send killers to finish what they couldn't take themselves. Kane smirked. You have no idea what you're sitting on. You think this is about gold? It's not. It's about control. The kind men like me build empires with, and men like you die protecting. Before Jack could answer, Kane nodded toward the SUV. The engine roared, and two more figures appeared, rifles in hand. Jack fired first, blowing out the porch light, plunging everything into darkness. Scout darted ahead. A ghost against the snow, attacking from the flank. Gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the cabin walls, splintering wood, sending dust and flame into the air. Jack dove behind the table, returning fire between bursts. Scout yelped once, a sharp cry that cut through the chaos. Scout! Jack shouted. He crawled across the floor toward the doorway, heart hammering. Scout was down near the steps, blood streaking the snow beneath him. Jack's vision tunneled. He fired at the shadowed shapes outside until his rifle clicked empty. Then suddenly, silence again. The SUV's headlights turned off. The men were gone. Only the wind remained. Jack dropped the gun and slid down beside Scout, pressing his hands against the wound on the dog's shoulder. Stay with me, soldier, he whispered, voice breaking. Don't you dare check out on me now. Scout's breathing was shallow, his fur slick with blood, but his eyes found Jack's and held them loyal, steady. Jack wrapped him in a blanket, whispering, You're all right. You're all right. Minutes dragged into hours before the first light of dawn crept over the ridge. The storm had passed. The snow outside was smooth again, covering the signs of the battle like it had never happened. Jack sat beside Scout, exhausted, eyes red from smoke and fear. He stroked the dog's head and whispered, They won't stop, buddy. Not until they've taken everything. But they picked the wrong soldier. Scout's tail moved weakly once. In reply. Outside, the cabin looked like a fortress, half broken by war. Smoke curled from shattered wood. But inside, the fire still burned. And in that quiet, with Scout alive beside him, Jack made a silent promise. He'd finish what his grandfather started, no matter the cost. By morning, the storm had cleared, leaving the mountain buried under 3 feet of snow. Sunlight broke through the pines, glittering off the iced shafts. The silence was almost peaceful. Too peaceful. Jack sat on the floor, Scout's head resting on his lap. The dog's breathing was shallow but steady. He'd bandaged the wound as best he could, though the bleeding had slowed. You hang in there, soldier, Jack murmured. We've got one more mission to finish. He poured himself a cup of cold coffee, hands trembling from fatigue. His mind replayed the night, the men, the gunfire, Kane's voice in the dark. Your grandfather stole from us. The words gnawed at him. Jack needed answers. Real ones. He turned to the old ledger again, flipping past the pages of financial records until something new caught his eye. A folded sheet tucked into the back cover, sealed with wax that had cracked with age. He peeled it open carefully, the paper thin as tissue. It was a letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. His grandfather's steady looping script. The ink had faded, but the words were clear enough to read. If you're reading this, the past has found you. The gold was only what they could see. The truth is buried deeper beneath this land, beneath their greed. Helios was never just mining for metal. They were after something else, something they shouldn't have found. When I learned what they'd done, I hid what proof I could. They came for me, but I kept my silence. If they find you, they'll come again. Tell the truth, no matter the cost. W. Harris, 1000, 962. Jack stared at the page until the words blurred. Something else. What had Helios found? Why had his grandfather been silenced for it? Scout stirred beside him, letting out a soft whine. Jack's jaw tightened. We're not letting them bury this again. He reached for the small camera he'd bought during one of his recent supply runs. It was cheap, but good enough to document what he had. He recorded everything. The vault, the documents, the letter. His voice was calm, but low. If you're seeing this, my name is Jack Harris. My grandfather, William Harris, was part of the original Rocky Ridge Mining Company, the predecessor to Helios. He discovered something under this land, something they killed to keep secret. When he finished, he uploaded the file onto a small USB drive and sealed it in a waterproof envelope. Then he opened his laptop, connecting it to Grace's secure email address. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. If I don't make it out, show this to the FBI. He hit send. Hours later, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, the rumble of engines broke the quiet. Jack stepped outside, shotgun in hand. 2 black SUVs were crawling up the snow-covered road. He could see men inside, silhouettes against tinted glass. He turned back to Scout. You stay put. You hear me? Guard the evidence. Scout growled softly in protest, but Jack pointed toward the basement hatch. Inside now. The dog hesitated, then obeyed, disappearing into the shadows below. Jack bolted the latch behind him and took a deep breath. He moved through the cabin like a soldier again, checking corners, reloading shells, clearing lines of sight. His training clicked back into place, sharp and automatic. The SUVs stopped 50 yards out. For a moment, the world went still. Then the doors opened and men in black tactical coats stepped out, weapons glinting in the sunlight. Jack shouted from the porch, "You're trespassing. This is private property." No answer. Just the crunch of boots on snow. He fired once into the air. The echo rolled down the mountain. Next one won't miss. A voice called back, calm, controlled. "Mr. Harris, you don't want to do this. We just need the files. Hand them over and you can walk away." Jack laughed bitterly. "Walk away? You already sent men to kill me. You think I'm going to believe that?" "Last chance," the voice said. Jack raised the shotgun. "Then you'd better make it count." The first shot came from their side. He ducked back into the cabin as the windows exploded around him. He fired blindly through the broken glass, hitting one man square in the shoulder. Another dropped behind a snowbank, returning fire. Splinters flew. Jack crawled to the back door and slipped out into the blizzard haze. The cold bit at his face, but adrenaline kept him steady. He circled the cabin, flanking the attackers from behind. Scout barked from the basement, sharp warning. Jack turned just in time to see a man approaching from the side porch. Rifle raised. He squeezed the trigger first. The man fell, rolling down the hill. Bullets whined overhead. The firefight was chaos. Close, fast, unforgiving. Jack's lungs burned with cold air. He ducked behind a tree, loading his last 2 shells. Then headlights appeared from the opposite direction, sirens faint in the distance, blue and red lights cutting through the snow. The attackers hesitated. Jack heard one of them shout, "Feds, move out." Within seconds, they were retreating toward the SUVs. A woman's voice called through a loudspeaker, "Federal agents, drop your weapon." Jack froze, breathing hard. The rifle trembled in his grip. The agents approached cautiously, weapons lowered. Behind the agents, a familiar face emerged from one of the vehicles. Grace Monroe pulled back her hood and hurried toward him. "Jack," she said softly, "it's over. You're safe." He let the gun drop into the snow. "Took you long enough." Behind her, agents moved in, securing the scene. A medic rushed past to check the wounded. Another headed toward the basement. Jack's voice cracked. "Be careful down there, my dog. He's hurt." Minutes later, Scout emerged, wrapped in a thick blanket, carried by a young agent. The dog's eyes fluttered open, searching until they found Jack. His tail gave a faint wag. Jack dropped to his knees beside him. "You did good, buddy. You did real good." Grace crouched beside them. "The FBI traced Helios's communications after you sent the files. They were monitoring you. Kane's operation goes deeper than anyone thought." Jack nodded weakly. "My grandfather tried to warn us." Grace held up the old letter sealed in a plastic bag. "And now you've finished what he started." The wind eased, and for the first time in days, the air felt clean. Jack looked out over the snow-covered valley. The sun was rising behind the ridge, painting the world in gold. He put a hand on Scout's fur, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat under his palm. "We're still here," he whispered. "We made it." Grace stood beside him, her coat flapping in the breeze, watching the federal agents secure the last of the evidence. Smoke still curled from the holes in the cabin's siding. The air smelled of pine, ash, and cordite. It reminded Jack of battlefields he'd promised himself to forget. An FBI agent approached, nodding respectfully. "Mr. Harris, we've confirmed Kane was intercepted while fleeing toward Denver. He's facing multiple charges: fraud, bribery, illegal mining operations, and more. He won't be walking free anytime soon." Jack didn't smile, but his shoulders loosened. "He'll still try. Men like him always do." Grace crossed her arms. "Not this time. The evidence your grandfather left behind, those stock certificates, the mineral claims, the ledgers, Helios can't bury them anymore. The company is under federal seizure now. It won't be able to bury this anymore." Jack looked down at the letter she still carried in its plastic sleeve. He risked everything to hide that truth. "My grandfather died alone to keep that secret safe." Grace looked at him. "And you finished what he started," she said softly. Jack glanced at Scout, who lifted his head weakly and licked Grace's hand. "Couldn't have done it without him," Jack murmured. The days that followed blurred into one long stretch of interviews, signatures, and silence. The FBI took their statements, documented every inch of the property, and finally left. Reporters tried to climb the mountain, but Grace had the area sealed off under federal protection. By the third morning, the mountain was quiet again. Jack stood on the porch of his damaged cabin, watching Scout limp through the snow, the bandage on his shoulder already dirty from exploring. The sight made Jack's throat tighten. "You're supposed to rest, soldier," he called. Scout stopped, turned, and gave a single bark as if to say, "Not a chance." Jack smiled faintly and went back inside. Grace arrived later that week, papers in hand, her breath steaming in the cold. "You should sit down," she said. "You're about to hear some numbers that'll change your life." Jack poured coffee for both of them and sat across the table. Scout lay between them, half asleep, his head resting on Jack's boot. Grace unfolded a document, her voice steady and calm. "The Department of Justice confirmed your grandfather's holdings were legitimate. After all the conversions and mergers, his shares account for 3.2% of Helios mining holdings." Jack frowned. "And that means what exactly?" Grace smiled faintly. "It means you're the legal owner of assets worth $257 million. The room went silent except for the crackle of the fire. Jack leaned back, staring into the flames as the number sank in. 257 million. It felt impossible, unreal, obscene. He finally said, "That's not money, that's weight." Grace tilted her head. "What are you going to do with it?" Jack stared at the ledger lying on the table between them. "I don't want it. Not like this. I just want to make sure something good comes out of it." "Then make that the legacy," Grace said. "Not the gold, not the mine. What you build from it." Jack rubbed his scarred hands together, thinking. Then he nodded slowly. "You're right." 2 months later, the snow melted from the valley. Trucks rumbled up the dirt road carrying lumber and materials. Jack oversaw every board, every nail. The cabin was repaired first, then expanded. The old shed was replaced by a small training yard. He called it Scout Foundation. Its mission was simple: to help wounded veterans and retired service dogs find each other to heal together the way he and Scout had. Grace helped him set up the legal structure, and donations began pouring in once the story reached the local papers. Jack turned down TV interviews and national spotlights. He didn't want fame, he wanted peace. By spring, the first pair arrived. A Marine veteran missing his right arm and a rescued Malinois missing part of its ear. Jack watched them train together in the yard. Both were learning to trust again. Scout lay in the shade nearby, tail thumping approvingly. Frank Dalton came by often, bringing coffee and quiet company. One afternoon, he stood beside Jack at the fence line watching the veterans work the dogs. "You done good, kid," Frank said. "Your granddad would have been proud." Jack looked out at the fields, the sunlight catching on Scout's fur. "He taught me that a man's worth isn't in what he finds, it's in what he leaves behind." Frank nodded. "Amen to that." In the evenings when the work was done, Jack would sit on the porch steps with Scout beside him. The old dog was slower now, his muzzle gray, his movements deliberate, but his eyes were the same. Bright, loyal, alive. Jack scratched behind his ear. We made it, buddy. From the war to the mountain to here. Guess we finally found our peace. Scout leaned against him, sighing contentedly. One night, Jack opened the old ledger one last time. Inside the back cover beneath the letter was a faded photograph. His grandfather as a young man standing beside a German shepherd in front of the original mine. The dog's expression mirrored Scout's almost perfectly. Jack smiled. Guess loyalty runs in the family. He placed the photo back in the book and closed it gently. The past could finally rest. Weeks later, a letter arrived by courier. Formal heavy paper embossed seal. It was from the federal court confirming the final settlement. The sale of Helios's assets, the liquidation of shares. The wire transfer already completed. Jack signed the acceptance papers, then transferred most of it, nearly 90%, into the foundation's account. When Grace raised an eyebrow, he just said, "Money can't buy peace, but it can sure build a place for it." That evening, as the sun dipped low, Jack and Scout walked the fence line together, as they often did. The air was soft, smelling of earth and pine. Birds called across the valley. Jack stopped at the edge of the property where his grandfather's claim marker still stood, half buried in moss. He knelt, brushing away the dirt, and whispered, "You kept your secret long enough. I'll take it from here." He stayed there until the stars came out, the mountain wrapped in silver light. Scout rested beside him, head on his paw, watching his human in quiet contentment. In that moment, there was no fortune, no company, no past or war, just a man, his dog, and the peace they had earned together. 1 year later, spring returned to the valley, and with it came laughter. Not the brittle sound of survival, but the full living kind, the laughter of veterans and trainers, and the barking of dogs. Echo Ridge Ranch had grown around the old Harris cabin that once leaned in decay. The scars of battle, bullet holes, shattered glass, burn marks, had been replaced with fresh cedar walls and bright open windows. Where the snow had once buried their world, grass now grew tall and green. A carved wooden sign hung at the front gate, its letters cut deep and proud. Echo Ridge Ranch, where soldiers heal. Jack stood at the top of the hill, watching two veterans run drills with their new dogs. Their commands echoed down the slope, firm, patient, sometimes trembling with emotion. He could see himself in them, the broken posture, the guarded glances, the way they stood a little straighter when the dogs obeyed. Grace Monroe walked up the trail toward him, her coat slung over her arm, hair catching the wind. "You did it," she said, smiling. "It's hard to believe this is the same place where you almost died." Jack chuckled softly. "Sometimes I still can't believe it either." She nodded toward Scout, lying nearby in the sun. Older now, grayer, but still regal. "And how's the hero holding up?" "He's slowing down," Jack admitted, looking at his old friend. "But he's earned every nap he takes." Grace smiled. "So have you." They stood in silence for a while, watching the ranch come alive below them. Workers put the last touches on the kennels. Volunteers painted the fences. Veterans walked shoulder to shoulder down the path toward the stream. "Frank stopped by this morning," Grace said finally. "Said he's never seen you look this settled." Jack grinned. "Guess he's right. Took me 40 years and a war or two. But I think I finally know what home feels like." A truck rumbled up the dirt road, tires crunching over gravel. The back was loaded with crates of dog food and training gear. A small American flag fluttered from the antenna. Jack waved to the driver and called out instructions, his voice carrying easily in the open air. As the noise faded, Grace turned to him. "You ever think about leaving the mountain?" Jack shook his head. "This place gave me back my life. Feels wrong to walk away from it. I'm not done here." She smiled knowingly. "You never will be." The afternoon passed quietly. By sunset, the sky turned gold again. The same gold that once reflected off snow and fear, now warm against the cedar walls and the ranch's new life. Jack sat on the porch steps, the same spot where he'd once whispered promises to a wounded dog. Scout climbed up beside him with effort, leaning into his leg. His fur caught the light, the faint silver along his muzzle glowing in the last of the sun. Jack reached down, scratching behind his ear. "You know, buddy, we found more than gold here." Scout looked up at him, those amber eyes steady and full of memory. "We found peace," Jack said softly. For a long while, they just sat together, listening to the sounds of the ranch, the clatter of feeding bowls, the laughter of new voices, the rhythmic bark of training drills. The world that once felt too heavy was now light, alive, forgiving. As night fell, lanterns flickered to life across the property, one by one, casting warm pools of light across the fields. Fireflies rose from the grass, their glow soft and fleeting. Jack watched them dance against the twilight, his heart full but calm. He thought of his grandfather, of the vault, of the years lost to anger and fear. He thought of the storm that had nearly ended him, and of the letter that had shown him the way forward. Sometimes he still woke to the echoes of gunfire, the weight of memory pressing down like snow. But now, when the darkness came, he had something stronger beside him. Scout's quiet breathing, the sound of life still moving forward. Inside the cabin, a plaque hung above the fireplace. It bore his grandfather's handwriting carved from the last page of the ledger. "Gold bought freedom, but silence kept us alive." Jack had added one line beneath it: "Truth built peace." He looked at the plaque now, the firelight flickering across the words, and nodded once in quiet gratitude. Scout stirred, laying his head on Jack's boot. The old dog's breathing was slow but even, eyes half closed, tail giving a single thump. "Rest easy, buddy," Jack whispered. "You earned it." The moon rose above the ridge, bright and clean, spilling silver light over the ranch. Wind moved gently through the fields, whispering through the grass, carrying with it a peace that had been buried for generations. Jack stood, taking one last look at the horizon. "This land forgave us," he said quietly, "and maybe so did I." He turned toward the house, the porch light glowing warmly behind him. Scout followed step by step until they disappeared into the soft light of home. The night seemed to widen around them past the cabin, past the fields, past the glimmering creek that had once run red with storm water. And on the wind, faint but sure, lingered the voice of an old soldier, calm and steady as a heartbeat. "We found more than gold, buddy. We found peace." If this story touched you, leave a simple 1 in the comments. It is a quiet way of saying that loyalty, courage, and second chances still matter. Even a small comment helps more people find stories like this. And if you'd like to walk beside us through the next journey of veterans, their loyal dogs, and the hidden stories buried in America's heartland, subscribe now and turn on the bell. A new story begins tomorrow right here.